In the modern world, we act as if men have become gods, that we are endowed with higher abilities of reason, judgment, and open-mindedness than our ancestors. We like to pride ourselves in how rational and logical we are. However, the truth is that there are lots of taboo subjects that cannot be broached in really any form in society without becoming a heretic. In fact, I think any deep discussions of what human nature is and how societies work will get you branded a heretic in the modern world. This video is here to discuss these subjects. I'm going to try to take a measured and fair look at all of these things that are really controversial and analyze the strengths and weaknesses of each argument. What happens when you make a discussion taboo is that only the radicals talk about it, and so I'm trying to be a voice of good reason and judgment here. Before we start, when you see the titles of these, that doesn't mean I agree with the contrarian take I'm putting. For many of these, I come out in favor of the status quo opinion. My highest aim is the truth, something which is simultaneously beautiful and ugly. This video will probably end up offending every part of the political, religious, and philosophic spectrums, and this is actually the first video of a two-part series. The next video I'll be releasing soon. But as an early Christian saint once said, if everyone likes you, you're doing something wrong, and you should aim to have the good like you and the evil hate you. Even if you disagree with me, and I mean I'm imperfect and constantly wrong like everyone else, I'd like you to take in good faith that I'm looking for the truth. If you dislike me politically and thus try to twist my words here to make me say something I really wasn't trying to say, to take me out of context or unfairly tear me down, then you're merely proving the inferiority of your morals and arguments through your own actions. With that out of the way, let's get started. There are a lot of topics covered in this video, and each demands a bunch of research on my end, but reading book after book can be tedious and time-consuming, and while I love reading, I'm frequently busy and on the move, especially with how much I travel. Audible has been a really big help with this. Audible is an app with a wide variety of content from audiobooks of every genre to podcasts by several different personalities and lectures on a variety of topics from history to math, and everything else you could think of. Audible is something for everyone and is easy to use, and as an Audible member you get one free title for each free month, regardless of its cost. No matter what you're looking for, Audible is something for you. I've listened to countless lectures by professors produced by the teaching company, which are all available at Audible for very reasonable prices, and Audible's credit system is really handy. I love working with Audible because they're a service I actually use on a regular basis. And Audible is currently offering a 30-day free trial to anyone who signs up, so download Audible or visit audible.com/whatifaultist or text whatifaultist to 500-500 and listen to whatever calls you today. Number 1. Does genetics have an effect on social class? Let me bring out this key fact. Intelligence is between 50 to 80% genetic. Surprisingly, genetics has a significant effect on basically every part of your life, whether your political affiliation, how fast you drive, or what music you listen to. This isn't controversial and all of modern scientists agree with it. The large heritability of intelligence is something that holds very powerfully across many studies. These studies come from identical twins raised in different families, normally of different social class, different region, etc. Large parts of society hold it as a religious truth that modern Western countries are inherently brutally oppressive and unfair, but this isn't held up by demographic data. Looking at social science data, we also know that modern Western societies are relatively meritocratic, and we're much more so if you look back a couple decades ago. Modern America is not a society run by old money wasps. You also have to keep in mind that in modern Western countries, the main road to wealth and influence is good grades and passing tests. That's basically creating a selection pressure for intelligence. The few studies on this taboo subject, which I don't fully trust, bear the evidence out for genetics and class very well. With all this going on, we have to assume there is a big genetic component to social class in meritocratic nations. There's a lot of confounding variables, kind of like a chicken and egg phenomenon, where the upper classes get more opportunities to study and test better. At the same time, I don't fully trust IQ and test scores as a metric. Everything here is so devilishly complicated. I just want to put this out here. I would never try to structure society around genetics. For almost all of history, people assumed the upper classes were genetically superior, but due to the decadence of growing up wealthy and in a society where everyone assumed they were superior, whenever they were in competition with the middle classes, they lost. At the same time, barbarians, often led by genius commanders, would continue to destroy decadent, educated civilizations. I also think viewing the world through IQ is dumb. You just can't pick a single metric and establish a person's worth around it. I think going back to the way that almost all of history was, of treating the rich as some superior state of being, is evil. And I think making social policy around the upper classes being smarter won't work. I mean, I think the fact historically that meritocratic militaries have almost always beaten non-meritocratic militaries means that the force of the lower social classes moving upwards through their own talent is far more powerful than the heredity of the pre-existing social elite maintaining itself. There's no way IQ isn't measuring something real and important, but I don't think it's full intelligence. Just as historic examples go, there's no way that people are 40% smarter than they were in 1910, which is what IQ would suggest, given that the language used in presidential debates was at an 11th grade reading level in 1910, and now it's at a 4th grade one. And educated people were expected to leave high school knowing 3 languages at the start of the 20th century. Likewise, anyone who's been to the third world knows that people there aren't dumber than first worlders. They are just some of the most entrepreneurial and creative people you will ever meet. I mean, to use some personal examples that I'm sure a lot of people can relate to, one of the smartest people I know grew up in poverty, didn't get good grades in school, and never went to college. And one of the dumbest people I've met grew up in wealth and is now going to a good school. I mean, I feel like a total jackass saying this, but I'm going to use myself as an example for why I think IQ is often broken. I have photographic memory. I can draw any country and any year in history off the top of my head. I write these videos off the top of my head. I'm easily in the 99th percentile in how much I read, and I dropped out of school when I was 19 because I was already running a successful business. And I'm about to have my 21st birthday, but from a statistical perspective, I have lower than average IQ, I didn't get good grades in school, and I didn't test well on the SAT. At the same time, IQ is one of the most verified and best studied things in modern science, and we know it does measure something really important, we're just not entirely sure what. Number 2, is Western philosophy a dead end? Ever since Pythagoras and Plato, and going through Descartes, and with postmodernism today, philosophy has kept on trying to get itself into arguing that the world exists. Am I the only person who finds this completely absurd? The world clearly exists, and if your philosophy doesn't line up with the world existing as its first point, your philosophy is wrong. Honestly, histories of Western philosophy often feel to me like gossip columns for nerds. This intellectual said these things that had negligible connection to the real world and then died, then this person commented and bickered back at them. I know what I said is extremely simplistic and kind of offensive in how much it is, but I think there is a point there, in that I have a couple problems with the trajectory of Western philosophy that I need to break down quickly. First, the Greeks believed logic to be superior than the outside world. This has resulted in lots of logical rabbit holes that have been disproven by modern science, and just testing the goddamn thing. The problem with Western philosophy has been that it puts logical argument above experience, but no one checks to see if the assumptions that go into the creation of that argument are even correct. Like almost all moral philosophy now starts with the assumption that harm is the worst possible thing that can happen morally, an argument that when it boils down to is fundamentally irrational. Almost all leftist philosophy starts with the argument that humans are inherently perfectible and improve morally with education, which again operates on faulty premises. We now start with the premise that everything can't be objectively proven doesn't exist, which then results in weird intellectual rabbit holes totally removed from how we actually live in the real world. Like saying good and evil doesn't exist, which basically argues that Santa Claus and Hitler are at the same moral level, which is not a useful prism through which to act in the world. Western philosophy is obsessed with forming a logical premise and then encapsulating the whole world inside of it, but that's too primitive a view of the world. This premise then purposely ignores any information that disagrees with it, which is like the opposite of the scientific method. Look at postmodernism, which says all social relationships relate to power, and then says anyone who disagrees with it is just a tool of the oppressive powerful. Western philosophy only survives since the vast majority of the citizens in Western countries are Christian. An emotional, humble philosophy that's counterbalanced the hubris of Western philosophy. Whenever philosophy is given full reign without religion, it results in the deaths of millions as philosophers try to build utopias. Ideologies are philosophies trying to take the place of religions. The philosopher mocks religion as outdated and then builds an entire theory of life around capital, communes, the nation, or social justice, and then adds an ism. With a worldview that simple and easy, the junk food of religions, it attracts the most unscrupulous and evil who hide behind the easy messaging. When you compare it to Eastern philosophy, which was so successful that it became a religion that totally dominated societies, you see a far more healthy and holistic look, embracing emotion, society, and man's place in the universe. Compared to Hinduism and Buddhism, Foucault and Schopenhauer intellectual masturbation. Also, I know I'm not being fair to the whole trajectory of Western philosophy here. What I'm really talking about is continental philosophy, which tries to build a worldview from logical premises. I place Western philosophy with humility, whether British empiricists who only look at what can be proven scientifically in that situation, Christian philosophers who know how little they are compared to God, and science, which is humility personified, as possibly the greatest contributions to the human race of all time. With the exception of Rousseau and the French Revolution, the Enlightenment, which tried to solve problems in the real world rather than building an entire worldview from a single precept, thus sparked the greatest era of progress in all of history, and was part of that tradition. Western philosophy, when paired with humility, which normally came either directly or indirectly from Christianity, accomplished some of the greatest good of all time, by creating a duality between humility and hubris. But at the same time, by itself, Western philosophy has done some of the greatest evils in all of history. Number 3. What were the negative effects of women entering the workforce? God, I hope this one doesn't get me killed, but it's kind of shocking that one of the biggest cultural shifts of all time, or women's mass entrance into a male-dominated workforce, cannot be commented upon in society. To do an objective analysis of the pros and cons will end your career. However, realistically, anything on this scale that happens this quickly, with the internet being a great example, will cause certain problems. Before we get started, I do want to say that if you look at a balance sheet, in my opinion, women's entrance to the workforce was positive, but I would have preferred a slower and more reasoned process. And I'm not saying we should have stuck with the old housewife system either, because due to changes such as the shrinking size in the family, where in 1800 your average family would have had 8 kids, and in 1950 you're at 2.5, as well as labor-saving devices like the washing machine, and later the pill, it just wasn't working. And if you look at the culture at the time, it seems like many housewives were just bored to death and not that happy. And so you had to see a change, and it doesn't surprise me we went for a radical one. And I mean, the fact that women themselves made the decision to enter the workforce as quickly as they did means something was broken in the previous system. Women's entrance into the workforce allowed them a greater degree of freedom than any era in history, but I still think it's important to look at the negatives. One of the big ones is depreciation in wages. By far the biggest factor in depreciating wages over the last 50 years, far beyond immigration, globalization, or any other factor, is women entering the workforce at higher rates, simply since there are so many women. People often don't think about how back in the 80s, it was normal to have a single father support a stay-at-home wife and multiple children. Now I would say most couples, with both parents working, can't afford to have any kids. This has created a problem for many women who would have wanted to stay at home, but now can't since other women have depreciated wages by entering the workforce. It's easy to overhype the economic growth that came with women entering the workforce, since housewives are actually pretty economically productive, having 80% of the economic value of a worker, and that was more pronounced for labor-saving devices. So if you go back to the world before, say, World War II, women had the same degree of economic value as the men who were working, it's just, it wasn't being paid for. And a lot of the costs come down to stuff like childcare, cleaning, or cooking food. It also created a lot of stress, where, as a bachelor, I can say managing all the chores in a house between cleaning, cooking, and the like comes down to a full-time job. And so, when both sexes are working, it leaves people with a lot less free time. The effects of this are borne out across society, ranging from collapses in sleep time to collapses in health, since families are eating out with unhealthy food more often. The obesity stats are basically the same as high fructose corn syrup consumption or vegetable oil consumption, and I sure can tell you that I'm not the one who's using high fructose corn syrup and canola oil in my home cooking. It's almost entirely restaurants. We're also not counting the intangibles of non-working women as well. Women are generally the bedrocks of community and do things like hosting social events, keeping communities together, and the like. In analyses, we've found that women entering the workforce is one of the biggest driving factors for the collapse in communities, social circles, and trust in America over the last 60 years. On top of this, we have found women have become less happy over time as they've entered the workforce. This is spelled out for women as a total demographic, and you also find working women and women who work more hours are unhappier as groups. Women in countries with lower labor participation are happier. We're also at an all-time high for female mental health problems now, across the historic record. My guess is that as women are forced into male-dominated work communities with high degrees of competition, which women due to higher trait neuroticism and lower testosterone on average find more stressful than men. Much of the modern feminist movement is women trying to redesign the workplace on a feminine basis, but the truth is that competitive organizations need to have a masculine edge to them in order to survive in a Darwinistic competitive world. There's a reason militaries are all manly, given that militaries that aren't manly lose. The entrance of women into the workforce en masse has resulted in massive growths in middle management and bureaucracy, as women want more order and less rough competition in the workplace. Finally, the massive mental health crisis among Gen Z may in a lot of ways be driven by children not having enough time with their mothers growing up. As mothers left for the workplace earlier, putting kids in daycares, we went through a giant social experiment never before seen in history, the results of which we're still bearing fruit of now. Children raised in daycares have significantly higher anxiety, much worse attachment, inability to maintain relationships, and higher depression. If you were looking for negative social effects of children not having enough time with their mothers growing up, the results would be exactly what they are. Number 4. Are some cultures better than others? People like to say that all things are equal and you can never judge quality, but really that's a non-argument since no one acts like that. You won't treat Genghis Khan or Gandhi as the same. Almost everyone will take a Ferrari over a rickshaw. Reality is how people act, not what they say. Once you open up that subjective differences do matter, you break apart all arguments that there's no difference in quality and good and evil don't exist. However, the idea that all things are equal and interchangeable is non-judgmental and thus in vogue now. The compromise of the post-World War II world was that all races were genetically equal, something I can firmly get behind and I think is a lot of strong evidence. However, it concept creeped into all cultures being equal, something that doesn't make a lot of logical sense. Look at it this way. Why would immigration happen if all countries and cultures are equal? Why would people invest in certain countries and not others? Why would certain cultures vanquish others in wars? I mean, just look at the statistics for hours worked, crime, educational output, and you find massive differences between cultures. If cultures were all equal, why would you see certain cultures able to successfully incorporate others, or cultures take on traits of other cultures? Japan wouldn't have westernized if the West wasn't doing something right, and people wouldn't have copied Roman fighting styles if the Romans weren't winning. The fact that you see such wildly variegated cultural norms and ways of life in the same geographies or in the same genetic pools means that culture is a very important factor in of itself. You can choose to explain these away with easy answers like geography or oppression, but those are pretty easy to disprove. Why do English-speaking countries with antithetical geographies like Australia, America, or the UK have the same income range? Or Latin countries, very different geographies and histories, same income range? Why do large empires often become poor while tiny city-states become wealthy? Any serious person will tell you culture is important to history. Anyone who has traveled a lot will tell you that culture changes how people think. There are 3 broad motivating factors for culture: guilt, shame, and fear that control almost every aspect of how people think in a society and how a society develops. In fact, you can see testable differences in how people from different cultures think in psychological surveys and what parts of their brains over or underdevelop. The idea that no cultures are better than others is really a faith-based argument to not judge and treat all cultures with decency and respect, which I understand and support. I will not adopt the customs of pygmy tribes in the Congo in my daily life, but I think they have a God-given right to practice them themselves and should be protected from exploitation. If I were to visit them, I would learn about their culture, partake in it, and respect and enjoy it. I think copying Peru's economic system is really dumb, but Peru is one of my favorite places to live in the world. The people are amazing, the food is incredible, and it's a really pleasant country in a lot of ways. Like with IQ, I would say you really shouldn't compare cultures by metrics. One of the biggest things that's made societies weak across history is arrogance and underestimating supposedly lesser peoples and not taking from them. There's no way you can possibly measure the infinite variables that make up culture, so don't try. View them as people or how you'd view a friend, as an individual with its own strengths and weaknesses. As an example, one of my best friends is an Afghan, and although Afghanistan's a country that's not doing so great right now, and there's not a lot to emulate from it, I have great admiration for their culture. They have a long and beautiful and proud history. They're remarkably brave people and often extremely kind, and amazing food. Their art is beautiful. And so, even though Afghanistan isn't successful now, an Afghan would have so much to be proud of, and that's the case of every culture in the world. Number 5. Why is sex so taboo? From a scientific standpoint, sex is the most important thing in life. That might sound cringe, but from a Darwinistic standpoint, it's correct. Not much matters in Darwinism except producing descendants who survive, or in other words, the redneck who had 7 children through 3 baby mamas beats the wise sage who achieved total happiness but died childless. However, strangely enough, given its massive importance, sex is the most taboo subject in our society. If a large public TV network accidentally showed pornography, it would be a scandal remembered for decades. However, they show gratuitous violence every day and no one bats an eye. If a wholesome newlywed couple had sex on a park bench in open daylight, it wouldn't be viewed as a wholesome continuation of the human race by 2 upstanding citizens, but as disgusting and depraved. It's considered disgusting for a mother to be naked with her 10-year-old child, who she literally knows everything about in birth, but why? I have a couple answers. The biggest I would say is fear of death. Although it's hard to tell, we don't think animals are aware that they must die. Animals fuck without worrying since they feel like it, but for humans who know we must die, and having left metaphorical Eden, we often try to push ourselves away from animals as much as possible. Thus, controlling sex makes us feel like we're not just those base things that fuck and die and repeat. We have meaning and value. The second simply is how important sex is. The most important things in society often become taboo. In many countries, talking about money is taboo. In the multi-religious and multi-ethnic modern America, talking about ethnicity and religion is. If a topic is super important, it becomes impossible to talk about it with evoking immense emotion and envy. The reason people don't immediately share their incomes is that it's such a massive driver of envy. In a society where sex is as unequally distributed as in our modern one, envy and the fear of it is a massive factor. A third being how sex has changed over the last 100 years, and society really hasn't caught up. Before World War I, unprotected sex brought a massive risk of STDs, and especially syphilis. Syphilis, for those that don't know, is a disease that literally causes people to go insane and then die, caused largely by promiscuous sex. Thus, societies across Eurasia became deeply invested in controlling sex and keeping it inside marriage after 1500 or the arrival of syphilis, in order to keep syphilis from spreading, which seemed like a literal verdict from God that sex, and especially promiscuous sex, was bad. The cultural trend that ended up with showing titties being worse on TV than a serial killer mauling people dates back to syphilis. The Middle Ages, and in some ways the early modern period, had much looser attitudes about sex. In some ways, like it being normal for friends to have sex in front of each other, parents in front of their children, or in the Middle Ages, lords would give local town girls to visiting noblemen. Not sleeping naked in bed with your family was rude, or unmarried girls would often run naked through the street on the way to the bath. If you want to go further back into the ancient world, you find a lot of crazy stuff like how the Egyptian pharaoh would masturbate publicly as a fertility rite every year, or how in ancient Sumer there would be temple prostitutes who would have sacred sex basically to honor the gods, or how in a lot of the ancient world, alongside modern Southeast Asia, people would literally worship penises for religious reasons, and these customs went away for a bunch of complicated reasons relating to the Axial Age. Social norms like this were gradually removed due to syphilis, but also since most of our quote-unquote traditional norms come from the urban middle classes of the 18th and 19th centuries, and they viewed being as prude about sex as possible as a way of removing themselves from the lower classes and the viscerally disgusting and filthy nature of the cities they lived in. However, the big question we have to consider is what sexual norms do we want? Even if we have the pill, our psychology and nature has hundreds of millions of pre-pill biological wiring, and so what's the healthiest and most human way to have sex? It's not free love. I myself am not a fuckboy, but most of my friends are, and after a certain point, every single time it gets meaningless and depressing. Likewise, girls almost always hate hookup culture and feel like they're being used and degraded. The effects of hookup culture due to hypergamy are a tiny group of men who get all the sex, the women who sleep with those men and never get the relationships most of them want, and most of men who get no action. This is a repeat of the horrifying sexual dynamics of most of history. This is fulfilling for no one and means there's a lot less total sex since people become cynical and stop trying. Also, remember how important sex is for society, and when it's done wrong, society falls apart time and time again in the historical record. We need to figure out what the value of sex is soon for the safety and survival of our society. Number 6. Are we inferior to our ancestors? I remember the first thing that came to my mind when I saw the whole movement to tear down statues and the like was, oh boy, we really do envy our ancestors, don't we? For those of you who don't know, I made a video at how envy affects societies, and it's really changed the way how I view the world, and to see how deep envy does go. And the only way I could make sense of why young people today are tearing down statues of Winston Churchill, writing white men out of the school curriculum, trying to blacken their ancestors' names, is that now we know in the bottom of our hearts that we don't match up to them. Let's look at it through this lens. The United States between 1850 and 1950 settled the West, ended slavery, ended real disease and poverty, beat or held back the multiple tyrannies of communism, Kaiserism, the Japanese, and the Nazis, went from cavalry charges to nearly landing a man on the moon, turning cities from filthy disease-ridden traps to beautiful latte and park-filled places, and gave women and ethnic minorities much better deals in the world and legal equal rights. Have any group of men before or since accomplished as much as they did in that time? The men of the West in that era will in 3,000 years be remembered the same way we think of the Greek miracle of Aristotle, Plato, Xenophon, Pericles, or the Stand of the 300. Now, what could we possibly do to compare? Make the iPhone, legalize gay marriage? We can say that, but we know in our hearts that we cannot possibly compare. In our private lives, compare your life to your ancestors 100 years ago, or your grandparents, and how they triumphed over much harder conditions than you did. For those of us with parents from non-first world countries, these comparisons are even more acute. It makes sense on an emotional basis that after those generations of great Western men, that their descendants would try to backlash, disown the culture they built, and even try to destroy the concept that comparison can happen, so as to ease the pain of knowing they cannot compare to their ancestors. I was listening to a tape of someone who was born in the 1850s from Pennsylvania, my home state, a man who remembered the Civil War, and the conversation was recorded in the 30s, and I was shocked to hear he talked in exactly the same accent as my grandmother. The people of the past were in many ways not too different from us today. I often think of how I could have had a conversation and been very good friends with many of the men who died in World War I. We could have talked about history, many of the same books, and would have shared many of the same notions. However, those men, many of whom came from middle-class backgrounds more comfortable than ours today, faced the utter unimaginable hell of trench warfare. One of my favorite historians is Amaury de Riencourt, who is completely obscure today and writes books at the history of civilizations, but when he was writing in the 1950s, had every single one of his books get a glowing review from the New York Times. Look at Will Durant, who wrote 1,000-page histories of civilization in the 1930s, each of which was a bestseller. Alternately, just read the intellectual level of debate of the Founding Fathers or 19th century political debates, or how many of the names of American cities founded in the 19th century had classical names like Utica, Syracuse, Spartansburg, Hannibal, etc. Imagine that degree of intellectual poise in the modern world, in our society obsessed with the Kardashians and the like. I love talking to immigrants. In a country like America, immigrants tend to often be the highest quality people from their home countries, and often had to do crazy things to arrive here. It blows my mind to hear how an immigrant from Burkina Faso had to cross the Sahara by bus, or a Bangladeshi immigrant had to wake up at 2 a.m. for the 2 hours when his neighborhood got water from the government. The thing it leads me to think about is how my own ancestors had to flee Ireland due to the potato famine, or had to clear the frontier fighting Indians, and how they must have felt having lived through crazy life and death stories. I've had 3 life and death experiences, and each have changed my life in the most beautiful possible ways. As I've talked about in my video on decadence, as life gets easier, people get softer, less formed, and less ambitious. We've seen this play out with psychological studies, with hardship and trauma forming character in many ways. What I see with our current era is how the medieval Islamic historian Ibn Khaldun's theory of how the first generation makes the empire, the second maintains it, and the third loses it. When I'm about to do something that scares me, I think about how many of my ancestors died in battle fighting for freedom, and how they'd call me a pussy. At the same time, I'm sure I had many ancestors that were horrible people and cowards. History contains both immense ups and downs that we have to focus on. In the same way that you had many ancestors who were superior to you, you had many that were inferior to you. However, an understanding of history is in many ways liberating from the constraints of the present world, and allows us to get a real perspective. Number 7. Does society need drugs to function? I'm writing this episode while drinking kratom, a low-level Malaysian and Thai powder that's used by plantation workers to work in the rubber plantations for their 12-plus hour shifts. I honestly drink it as a way to deal with the stress of my life. You might judge me, but briefly make a note on the amount of people who do self-medicate with some kind of substance. Also, remember that most people don't talk about this. I think a majority of people I know do it in some form, with weed being the most common, and alcohol, tobacco, and vape, and the other like being other forms. On top of this, look at the prescription drug epidemic, whether through opiates or antidepressants. If we want to expand this definition, practically everyone in our society is addicted to sugar and coffee, and that is the foundation of some of the most integral aspects of our industrial society. I mean, it kind of does make sense. This is an era of history in which most people live objectively hard lives and are incapable of achieving the things that our parents took for granted, like affording to start families, get homes, and the like, alongside with mass political, social, economic, and other problems. That's a hard world to grapple with, a world in many ways out of the hands of control of normal people. If we look across the history of the world, this kind of coping, although it's not great, is very common. Most traditional societies consume a tremendous amount of alcohol, and those that don't find some other substitute like hashish, opium, khat, or kratom. If we look across the history of civilization, no one industrializes without stimulants like caffeine, and beer and other alcohol always come in with civilization. The question I posit is whether civilization requires drugs. My answer is probably yes. I think in a lot of ways civilization differs so much from inherent human nature that we use drugs as a way to basically make up the psychological difference. Remember, we evolved to be in hunter-gatherer communities living in tribes, and now we live lonely in hyper-crowded cities, often crowded behind desks our whole day. Even before that, we spent all days toiling in the fields. I often view it like how carriage horses have their eyes covered so that street traffic doesn't panic them. As I sit in my New York City apartment, looking out across the street to a shit ton of other more apartments stacked together like crates, I realize how we humans have constructed the same conditions for ourselves, and drugs are like our blinders. On top of that, when used appropriately, drugs are just fun. Think of how many positive memories are formed with alcohol, or how many times a night out will let out steam from a rough week at work. Although it is unhealthy, I do understand it for coping. A big reason I dropped out of college was that I was working myself to death trying to do classes and my full-time job as a YouTuber at the same time, and I was consuming an unhealthy amount of alcohol to calm my nerves down, and I knew it wasn't healthy, so I dropped school. An interesting trajectory that we're investigating is how much effect psychedelics had on early religions, being central to the formations of early Christianity and Hinduism at least, and probably other religions, and being central to almost every tribal and shamanic tradition. Societies mixed them with rituals, dancing, and celebrations in order to gain higher levels and reach the spirit world to balance out the mundaneness of normal life. For those that have done them, reaching the higher spiritual level with stuff like ayahuasca, peyote, and the like is some of the most meaningful experiences a person can have. I'm not going to denounce drugs blanketly, however, I think we need to use them responsibly. We need to keep people from addiction and also use drugs for their positive effect. Now we're in a society that either fully denounces drugs or lets people use them whenever they want, and neither of those is really good. We can't get rid of civilization, but we can massage it more easily if we use substances correctly. Number 8. Why is diversity good? For the modern left in Western countries, diversity is the #1 thing they push for. In every single circle, having as many people as possible of different racial, ethnic, and gender backgrounds, that organization becomes automatically better for some reason. Likewise, Western countries should import as many people from different ethnicities as much as possible all the time. However, I've never heard a coherent argument for why diversity is a good in of itself. I mean, many of the most successful societies in history were homogenous. Look at ancient Athens, which was a tiny homogenous citizen population that accomplished an insane amount of everything. Or look at how largely homogenous countries like France, England, Germany, and the like accomplished a tremendous amount of things across their history. Likewise, when we look at the richest and most successful countries in the world today, they tend to be countries that have historically been exceptionally homogenous or are very homogenous today, like Sweden, South Korea, Japan, or Finland. On average, homogenous countries tend to be more successful than diverse ones, given that it's easier to coordinate people who share the same cultural assumptions. Meanwhile, most diverse societies in history have been giant autocratic empires, where the elite was a single ethnic group or an alliance of 2 ethnic groups, and they ruled over all the other ethnicities. Examples like this include the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian, Roman, Mughal, or Spanish empires. You really do not have a lot of examples of successful culturally diverse societies. In democracies like Belgium, South Africa, or Canada that have multiple hegemonic cultures, all inhabitants will readily admit how difficult it is to coordinate these various ethnic groups. It involves an incredible degree of pain, inefficiency, and hassle. Look at most African countries where one tribal group seizes power of the country and use it as a vehicle to steal from the other tribe. This also ignores how many states across history and empires failed due to changes in ethnicity and ethnic dissolution. Look at the Roman Empire, where, due to declining birth rates among the Roman citizen class and Germanic immigration, the empire fell apart. The same thing's true with the Turks entering into the Abbasids. Alternately, the lowering of the Russian and South African white birth rate and the dissolution of the unified USSR and apartheid South Africa. There are examples of diversity working, an example of which is the immense spreading of culture and ideas that came with the foundation of the Islamic Caliphate in the Middle Ages, or how the United States was able to incorporate immense amounts of immigrants from different countries and continents to make it stronger, wealthier, and more interesting. However, in both of these cases, there were hegemonic cultures, whether Arabic or Anglo-American, that immigrants were allowed or expected to assimilate to, and provided leadership to the broader society, which the modern left also views as evil. This proves diversity can work and can have positive effects, but also doesn't seem to be necessary for a successful society and can go very badly. The thing that holds society together is shared blood, shared beliefs, and common enemies. And this is totally ignored by people who push for diversity. There's no discussion of the effects of diversity or its history, which for the left is an element of religious faith in of itself, and aims for diversity without any logical or historical argument. I think the fundamental truth is that this comes from a self-loathing in which these leftists think there is something fundamentally wrong with being white and Western, even though they're the most successful societies in the world today, and would like to erase them as much as possible. There isn't really any other argument that makes sense for it. And I mean, given this is people who literally say they want to erase whiteness and Western civilization, although it sounds bombastic, I think it's true. Number 9, is war good? God, this one feels so loaded. However, a very strong argument can be made for it, one that's made in the excellent book War, What Is It Good For by Ian Morris. The world is made up of incredible paradoxes, almost by nature, and this is one of them. Let me explain. Competition is the biggest driver of progress, and war makes a lot of competition. The easiest examples of this are early modern Europe, in which Asia crystallized into a series of vast empires that had little competition for survival, while Europe was a series of smaller states that were locked into permanent war. This meant that Asian militaries didn't have to innovate in a life-or-death manner, while if, say, England didn't keep up with the latest innovations with France, England would get conquered. This is one of the biggest reasons why we see so much technological progress in this time period. To show how, I'm going to talk about European colonization of the Indian Ocean area, where first came the Portuguese, who were corrupt and decadent, followed by the Dutch, who were cruel yet competent, and they in turn were followed by the British, who, by the standards of European colonial powers, were the most competent and also benevolent of all these powers. However, in most places in history, the Portuguese would have stayed in power the whole time. I mean, one of the big things that resulted in the collapse of the cruel bondage states of the Bronze Age into becoming the more humane ones of the Iron Age was the intensification of warfare. We see that these kind of cruel slave states kept going in areas like Southeast Asia or the Sahel in Africa that never had the same degree of military competition as the areas in the main Eurasian theater of violence. At the same time, saying violence solves nothing is just blankly untrue if you quickly think at how violence solved American slavery or the Nazis. War is one of the biggest drivers of technological progress, with some examples in the modern world being the development of the internet, computers, tampons, antibiotics, highways, nuclear energy, cell phones, and I could go on. If you want to extend this across almost all of history, war has resulted in a tremendous amount of technological progress that has saved far more lives than war has taken. Compare war to disease, for example. All wars combined across history has killed somewhere in the range of 200 million people, a majority of which died of diseases during the wars, while improvements in health have resulted in 5 billion lives saved over the last 200 years, or 25 times that number of lives saved. The invention of penicillin, for example, which was driven by World War I, saved 120 million lives, 8 times the death in that war, and twice the casualties of the bloodiest war in all of history, World War II. Likewise, vaccinations, which were pushed and implemented by societies in order to lower the deaths of disease in armies, which were a majority of deaths in war, have in turn saved hundreds of millions, if not billions of lives. The state exists due to war. Every country in the world exists since a group of conquerors decided to subjugate it, or a group of locals teamed up to form a government to hold off invaders. The thing is that the state has greatly increased commerce and safety, and general quality of life. If you look at pre-state peoples, you see that 15 to 40% of males died from warfare every generation, and murders and revenge killings were extremely common. However, once you see the state become more powerful, and this is a trend we've seen across history multiple times, you see death rates from war collapse to not even being close to pre-state levels, and murder and violent crime rates collapse. I can't say war is good. War is one of those things that's caused so much unimaginable suffering across history that to say it's positive would be an evil joke to those that have suffered under it. However, since the world's normally paradoxical, war is necessary. It reminds me of a quote I read in a book on the history of disease that said, "You may hate disease, but in the pre-modern world, it's the only reason why people weren't starving all the time." I view war as both a stabilizing and chaotic force in the human condition, much like death that we will never be able to transcend because it is part of the game. War is the main thing that forces societies to be on top of their game, that forces them to excel to their highest levels while also bringing out their greatest barbarity. The reason big wars happen with very shocking regularity is that the history of the world is people constructing things to deal with the chaos of the real world, but those organizations in turn lose touch with the reality they're trying to stop, and then war calls their bluff. War and the Four Horsemen in general are the chaos of the real world smashing into the often decadent and rotting structures of human frailty. Number 10. How much of society is built around hatred and envy between the sexes? It's interesting to hear both men and women complain about modern dating. It's kind of funny and depressing at the same time that they both think they have the rotten end of the deal. Guys say they don't get any dates and all the girls they meet are psychos, and girls think that all the guys they meet are flaky fuckboys. They don't meet any good men who actually care about them as people. Which brings me to the question, to what degree is this normal and to what degree is our society doing something massively wrong? I'd like to posit that the tension between the sexes, which manifests in both positive and negative ways, allows the survival and improvement of the human race. For men, the central point is that men are biologically less useful than women, given that a woman's egg is so much more expensive in real terms than a man's sperm, that a single man can impregnate 1,000 women, meaning that those 999 men really don't need to be there. But the value of a woman's egg is stable at basically one child a year. However, men coming from this fundamental insecurity have built up a series of methods to compete with each other and also discount this female advantage, which when added together gives men a massive advantage over women. I once told a female friend that testosterone's like a steam kettle that just keeps on pumping the guy with energy until it gets redirected somewhere or the guy goes insane. This is historically accurate in the societies in which men aren't married at a young age, universally start a shit ton of wars, and have really high crime rates. The brilliant feminist philosopher Camille Paglia once said the reason there isn't a female Mozart is the same that there isn't a female Jack the Ripper, and that testosterone gives men an unforgiving clock in the back of their heads that can either lead them to greatness or evil. The cruelest aspects of toxic masculinity include the Nazis or Imperial Japan, who took aggressive masculinity to an extreme. Alternately, the pathetic machismo of many third world countries in which masculinity involves fighting, drinking, and largely having your wife do the real work and support the kids and put up with your bullshit, thus preventing their societies from growing, or the truly toxic masculinity of enslaving women's personas and sexes for their egos, whether through female genital mutilation, foot binding, keeping women at home all day, or harems. The continuous male drive across history comes from the insecurity of knowing that if things go wrong, they lose the game of life. And weak men turn this into hatred of women. Meanwhile, the female insecurity and envy of men comes from them never building up the competitive advantage men have, given that they just never had to compete as hard. Women don't feel the need to pose as much in the same way as men do to justify their existences. However, at the same time, women feel envy that men built up the main organs of society, whether the military, government, corporations, and religions, as side effects of their competition, thus giving men massive advantages in turning all societies in the human race into patriarchy, and at the same time, the insecure edge men have from the clock in the back of their heads that is testosterone. Women realize that human society is a patriarchy, but don't have the inclination to build any realistic structures that would replace it. Likely since they never had to form teams to hunt or wage war back in the Stone Age, thus toxic femininity looks like tearing down the organizations that hold society up while focusing on useless minutiae which gradually kills the society. This can look like social justice, the witch trials, or the stifling collectivism and family controls of China or India, all of which are women using their social pressures to turn society into madness or for raw social control through petty bullshit. Since men have the physical and social advantage, women have learned to be more socially adept and operate through relational warfare, which in some ways is more dangerous than direct combat since it can't be directly defeated. An example of this is the Me Too movement, in which we're at the point where any man's career can be ruined by any woman saying he sexually harassed her with absolutely no evidence, which anyone would realize would be a horrible way to structure a society, but toxic femininity, basically pushing you have to listen to women all the time with no rational argument behind it, is causing the social pressure which will have and is having horrible effects on society. Due to the differences in strength and aggression between the sexes, direct competition between them is extremely difficult to manage, and means that women can get away with being more provocative than men because society doesn't take them as seriously. Let's just use an example of an intellectual debate where a man and a woman are in a rational debate and the woman is being extremely provocative. If the man were to counter her in a direct yet rational way, forcing her to pull out her evidence and digging into each of her individual points to a great depth, if the woman breaks into tears, even if the man is doing what he has to do to prove his point logically, the audience will side with the woman. The female response to being held to aggressive male standards and competition is that those standards are inherently toxic and should be removed, but because women have never been expected to be in the competitive edge of society, they don't understand that those competitive aggressive standards are there, and we put them because if they weren't there, we would all die. The extreme difficulty of coordinating competition between men and women is why basically every society in history, going back to the Stone Age, has structured occupations in a gendered way between men and women, with their own spheres. On top of this, our society has done a poor job of mixing up things that make more sense through a feminine mindset, make more sense with a masculine mindset. In our daily interpersonal lives, the feminine way of managing social relations and being forgiving and emotional works better, while in the modern world we try to over-rationalize and split people into different categories in our daily lives that's very mechanical and depressing. While meanwhile, using feminine forgiveness or lack of competition for stuff like war or business and the like is just a road to social decay and being conquered. At the same time, you do need a balance of both in their own places for a healthy society. What both sexes need is to basically take responsibility for their own problems and love and appreciate the other sex for where they are. A real man knows that women aren't evil and doesn't put them on a pedestal either, but knows that we have to work together with our strengths and weaknesses for the further propagation of the human race. The other sex aren't an amorphous blob, they're people. A good man is able to love women since he can love being a man. However, this is the opposite of what modern society pushes. Healthy relations between the sexes involve each sex knowing who they are while also empathizing with the other sex. What modern society does is to microscope all gender relations, offering no forgiveness for mistakes made, and then trying to create a war between the sexes to upset relations for social change, but fails to ignore that you cannot have war between the sexes since they always need to work together for society to function. War between the sexes, not cooperation and understanding, is a road to insanity for both sexes and the collapse of society, both of which we're seeing now. I consider incels and radical feminists, cat ladies and weebs to be the same symptoms of this social pandemic. Well, I wonder what you folks thought about that video. As always, thanks for watching, stay tuned for future videos, and check out my Patreon and Pearl and Pillar. As always, thanks so much and have a wonderful day.